On Election Day, California voters passed Prop.12, which some called the most progressive animal law in the country. Too bad the animals didn't get to vote. They know that cage-free doesn't mean cruelty-free. But voters approved Prop.12, which allows companies to market to consumers compassion, but leaves animals cramped in factory farms. What you can do now, next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, cage-free Prop.12 in California, good for PR, still bad and cruel for the animals.
Unfortunately, this proposition was hailed as much bigger of a win than it actually is when you start looking at it. Vegan food is just booming. The popularity of being vegan and even just the issue of animal rights and talk about animal liberation is much more mainstream these days. And in that context, we just don't understand why we're asking for inches, literally inches, when we could be going miles for these animals.
Amber Canavan from PETA's Campaigns Department on the truth about Prop.12. On Election Day, voters in California approved the animal measure, which advocated cage-free sources for hens by 2022, and the approval was by more than 60%. But were voters duped? Canavan said while Prop.12 provided minimum space requirements for chickens and other farm animals, animals are still cramped and mistreated. Canavan said there were a number of issues that could have been included, like how hens are treated after their egg-laying years.
Hens aren't productive after a period of time. Their egg production goes down, and there is no retirement home for them. They're usually killed before their second birthday. There's either going to be a situation where they're sent to the slaughterhouse, or we've also seen that they will just go ahead and gas them on site.
Canavan makes other suggestions for what could have been and suggestions for what you can do now. Next on the PETA Podcast. But first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. Please share a link with friends. Let them know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. And keep binging. There's lots to listen to here on the PETA Podcast. Meet PETA President and co-founder Ingrid Newkirk in Episode 1. Debunk all the myths you may have heard about PETA. Do they really have supplies of blood for activists to throw on fur coats at protests? Of course not. Ingrid knows the truth. One of my favorites, PETA's Chief Counsel Jeff Kerr, featured in Episode 2 on the link between civil rights and animal rights. And find out more about a muscular dystrophy patient from the UK who flew 10 hours from England to Texas A&M to protest that university's useless experiments. His interview in Episode 32, then check out Episode 9 to find out more about how Texas A&M tortures dogs, giving them muscular dystrophy, knowing full well it has little relevance toward finding a cure that works for humans. Remember, if you're on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps the algorithm know that PETA has a podcast on the issues important to you. Now, if you really want to help the animals, you can always hit the Donate Now button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Alexa, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. They call it direct democracy. Bypass the legislators and take an issue directly to voters. California's Prop.12 promised more space and cage-free environments for animals raised for food. Maybe the legislature should have taken a swing at that one. But to the voters, well, they passed it by more than 60%. And possibly because it got support from some animal groups. Just not from PETA, who saw Prop.12 as just not good enough. Were voters fooled by Prop.12? My conversation with Amber Canavan of PETA Campaigns on the PETA Podcast. Did people get duped by Prop 12 this time around?
Absolutely. The proposition, as it's written, it's no surprise that Californians care about animals and want to see them treated better. And, they look to animal protection groups for guidance regarding where to direct that sentiment. Now, do we continue the fallacy of this humane meat and happy eggs, though? Or do we build on the increasing demand for vegan foods and steer these compassionate people in that direction instead? And that's where we've been taking this argument with Prop 12 since the beginning, before it even had the name of Prop 12, when thousands of volunteers were going out and gathering signatures for this.
Well, it was advertised in a lot of commercials before voting day as a measure to keep animals or to help animals raise for food. But does it really help animals? Why did PETA oppose it so vigorously?
We just can't understand how the bar was set so low for this initiative. It really just is cementing in intense confinement for birds and pigs and calves. For hens, egg-laying hens were exploited for their eggs. They would get just 1 square foot of space each. We would never accept this small of a space for other species, but we seem to have still have this unintentional, maybe blind spot or speciesism for chickens. We would never accept cramming them in that tightly of a space. But that's what happened with this proposition.
PETA opposed this, and it may have come as a surprise to some voters. What does it say to, when PETA opposed it so much versus some other groups, which, do have some credibility, but they were for Prop 12? What does it say about what exists between, say, those groups and PETA, which opposed Prop 12?
PETA has always supported, incremental steps that improve the lives of farmed animals, but we just could not, in good conscience, support this initiative. It does nothing to end the suffering that hens exploited for their eggs endure. Abolishing cages just doesn't accomplish this, and the initiative requires that animals be provided with the absolute bare minimum amount of space. The same amount of space the industry already requires for so-called cage-free eggs. And I'll bring up an example of a recent PETA eyewitness investigation into a free-range egg supplier called Nellie's Free Range. And this farm, this company actually has standards that are higher than what Proposition 12 requires. So free range, this farm requires 1.2 square feet of space above the 1 square foot of space that Prop 12 requires. And they also give the hens what they call access to the outdoors. During the course of this investigation, we find that access really doesn't mean necessarily that those hens are getting out every day or necessarily even every week or necessarily ever at all. Just that they had the chance to, if they were to fight through the 20,000 other hens that were crammed into this shed, with only access to these small hatches that were spaced out along the sides of the barn. And even then, once they did get out, if they could fight through all these other thousands of hens, they just have this narrow strip of grass and gravel. That's even a step up from what Proposition 12 required, and it is still just a living hell for these animals.
And you're saying that this company had higher standards, right? And they were still, PETA went in there and looked at things and didn't see where it was very good. Now we have Prop 12, and now this company can do even less. Now that they're required, they can get away with even less good done for the animals that they're that they're selling for food?
Well, I wouldn't say it would necessarily go both ways. This company has their own standards that they keep at 1.2 square feet. It would certainly allow them to sell in California. It would be compliant with Prop.12. But I guess what we're saying is that compared to what was hailed as this groundbreaking animal welfare law in California, and then you go and look at a company that's actually doing, a tiny bit better than what Prop 12 requires, and realizing how just objectively awful it is for the hens that are living even in that system that's supposed to be better of the best. It really just highlights how focusing on these labels like cage-free or free range, we're really getting distracted by this specter of the cage. And don't get me wrong, battery cages are awful. The hens are just crammed in to these tiny cages in warehouse-like sheds with rows of them stacked on top of each other. And at this point, I think everybody's probably seen footage of a battery cage facility, and nobody would agree that that's an okay living condition. But at the same time, consumers are looking to do more. They are at least somewhat aware of these routine cruelties in the egg industry. And when they hear something like Prop 12, they say, oh, that sounds really good. Let's do that. But as soon as you start looking a little bit closer at what these labels like cage-free and free-range actually mean, the hens are still confined to giant sheds crammed by the tens of thousands. And furthermore, Proposition 12 also, by focusing just on the cage, we're not thinking about all of the other ways that hens used for their eggs are harmed and exploited during the process. So this does nothing to help them when they're on at the hatchery, when they're born, before they even come to the farm. These baby chicks are hatched in giant incubators. Their brothers, no matter whether it's free range or cage-free or pasture or whatever label they put on it, all of their brothers are going to be killed the day that they hatch. And the common industry method is either wrapping them up in a garbage can or a dumpster and suffocating them, gassing them to death, or grinding them up alive in a process called maceration. And that's literally grinding up baby chicks alive. You might as well be throwing them in a blender.
So Prop 12 just doesn't do enough, allows for bad things to continue to happen. And so it's clear why PETA opposed it. But why would some animal organizations support Prop 12?
Well, I wouldn't want to put words in their mouth. But I mean, having a win for the animals in this movement is incredibly important. And unfortunately, this proposition was hailed as much bigger of a win than it actually is when you start looking at it. These organizations know that people care enough about animals to vote on it and get it passed and get that win. But it's really not as big of a win as you'd really think until you take a little bit closer of a look and realize, in this day and age, vegan food is just booming. The popularity of being vegan and even just the issue of animal rights and talk about animal liberation is much more mainstream these days. And in that context, we just don't understand why we're asking for inches, literally inches, when we could be going miles for these animals.
So what needs to happen for hens and pigs and other animals in California? What kind of legislation does PETA want to see passed instead of Prop 12? And instead of something that goes direct to the voters and they get fooled to pass something that's really lightweight, what is the kind of decent, good, hard legislation the legislature needs to address that would satisfy PETA and really help the animals? What is that kind of legislation?
Legislation is one thing. Really, right now, we need to change how our society is treating and using these birds in the first place. So a lot of our efforts are focused on, in the first place, just exposing these so-called humane labeling. And, nothing's on the books or on the docket as far as we know of that would be something we'd jump on. But these initiatives are extremely costly as far as money and activist time, volunteer time. Proposition 12 itself cost about $16 million and countless hours of activist time. Just imagine what kind of progress could have been made by investing those funds in vegan egg products or educating consumers on why they don't need to consume eggs in the first place. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what kind of legislation that would be, aside from maybe removing the subsidies to these industries that the government currently gives, or a campaign that we've had for probably about a decade, which is actually now starting to gain more steam, is our tax meat campaign, similar to a excise tax on cigarettes or sugar or gasoline, that the meat, dairy, and egg industries should be taxed for the toll they take on animals, the environment, human health.
All right. So I understand that. And you make a good point that instead of hard, tough legislation done by the legislature that would, make them work as members of our representative government, they went direct, or some people went direct to the public and said, let's vote this in. It was a very low bar. It still cost $16 million. And as you point out, it could have done much more. We settled for inches when we could have had miles. We could have accomplished miles of good for the animals. So let's do this. Let's play pretend. We're both legislators. We want to put a tough bill together. We see how abysmal Prop 12 is. What would we want to see in ideal legislation that would help the animals? I mean, clearly the space issue, we need more, right? We'd want that in, right?
I mean,
look, this is pretend, okay? You're not really a legislator, but I'm making you a legislator for this podcast. And we can create an ideal piece of legislation. This is our game of how to create the perfect animal rights legislation that would be so much better than Prop 12. Just go by point. What would we do in terms of space? Would we want more space or less space?
Well, I think getting the animals out of these systems in the first place would be the first step. So if this is truly an animal rights legislation versus animal welfare, we'd be promoting only plant-based vegan foods.
All right. Now I
don't know how long I'd be in office at this point.
Well, see, all right. That's a fair point. So you have to bring it in a little bit because you got to get it passed also. I'm not asking you to compromise, but I'm just saying we saw what mediocrity Prop 12, brings in terms of real results to the animals. What do you think would be just a little further? Get us, instead of that inch, get us that at least a mile of good. What would be a fair compromise, you think, that would help the animals instead of Prop 12? How much space would we need to give to the animals?
Well, a heck of a lot more than they get now. Right now, it's the cage-free standard is 1 square foot, so at least a couple more on that. But any discussion about space, really, we need to also be talking about all of these other standard industry practices that are built into the system that are incredibly cruel. So,
like what? Tell me about them. We'll get it into legislation. Remember,
Sure.
This is our ideal legislation. This
Ideal,
is the ideal Prop.12, the better Prop.12. So we would we would increase the space, but we would do what else?
A ban on killing day-old male baby chicks. A ban on debeaking hens.
And that was nowhere in Prop.12, right? You saw none of that in Prop.12. No. So, and killing those baby chicks, the debeaking, that would be something definitely in an ideal a better Prop.12. What else would you put in?
Well, another thing that doesn't often get talked about in regards to the egg industry is that hens aren't productive after a period of time. Their egg production goes down, and there is no retirement home for them. They're usually killed before their second birthday. And, there's either going to be a situation where they're sent to the slaughterhouse, or we've also seen that they will just go ahead and gas them on site. So a ban on that would be a good place to start. And just these couple of things, what have we talked about? Space, male chick culling, debeaking, and then killing hens who aren't productive anymore. That's 4 main points. I mean, if you just think about how cheap eggs are in the store, how easily people can get them without a thought, to the hours and hours it took a hen to lay just one egg, how much that would cost to just give these bare minimum, just knock out these couple of bare minimum, awfully cruel things that we do to them. People probably wouldn't be willing to pay that cost, and they might choose vegan options instead.
Yeah. And just in these few minutes, when we have crafted some key points for this ideal, better than Prop.12 legislation that we would have, we would do more for the animals than the Prop.12 that people voted on in California and passed, right?
Yeah. If we had been able to be at the helm, but the thing we're always saying is there's no time like the present, especially in this political climate. People might be feeling disempowered, and maybe that's another reason why you look to a proposition versus relying on your legislature to do something. But the power and the beauty of activism and of going vegan is it's something you can do now. There's no need to wait. You can jump in and really make these powerful changes and not have to be waiting on these big institutions and legislation that might take a long time to pass and is really just so full of compromises that you're kind of wondering what we're doing in the first place.
Well, see, now, Amber, look at what you've done now. So we have created ideal legislation in our fantasy world that would be good, that would be better than Prop.12. But now you, in the next breath, have suggested an even better form of direct democracy. And that is when you eat, vote for the animals, and go vegan. Well, that's about as direct as it gets, right? So we don't need Prop.12, which is why a no vote on Prop.12 would have been better, to vote no on Prop.12 and then go vegan, right?
To go vegan and get active for the animals in every part of your life. PETA has all of the tools to help people not only go vegan, We've got all the recipes and the vegan starter kits and the vegan mentor program. But we've got a dedicated team of people whose, only job it is to help activists, be empowered to speak up for animals, every day, whether it's, demonstrations or leafleting or any number of other things that they might do in their communities. If we are going to do something for the animals, what do they really need? And they need to be not in cages, but not exploited in the first place for things that we really don't need. We don't need to consume eggs anymore. We don't need to consume milk from another species anymore. We've got all of these great alternatives, and I hate to call them alternatives. They're just vegan food. That's what it is. It's all there right at our fingertips.
And people just simply have to make the choice and to go forward and to move. Now, we mentioned this earlier about the labels, the cage free and all that. Are they just labels with Prop.12? Don't they do a little bit, or is it just kind of like this, a kind of a Band-Aid that makes people think that they're doing something, but it's not really doing enough?
Right. These companies know that the public is concerned about these issues, and they've been very clever and learned to exploit this compassion that people are feeling for farmed animals. And they found that by using these buzzwords such as humane or ethically sourced or cage-free, just if you think about it for a second, it conjures up these lovely images of animals in the grass and the sunshine. And going back to the example of Nellie's, that is absolutely their advertising MO. They say it over and over again. Our chickens love being out in the sunshine and the grass. And then you actually take a look at what's happening on the inside is, they're in the same factory farm shed as all the other chickens, but they're still able to slap that label on it and get people to buy that thing that maybe they wouldn't have if they had known.
So one last time, in the aftermath of Prop 12 passing, what do you advise California residents and people everywhere to do now to help animals used for food?
First of all, take a critical look at those labels and don't believe any of those labels that are on a product that comes from an animal. It is not humane. If it came from the store and it came from an animal, that animal suffered, whether it was milk, eggs, or their flesh. And educate your friends and family. A lot of us now have friends and family who also might be becoming a little more aware of farmed animal issues. Maybe they're not quite ready to go vegan yet, so they have started to buy into these free-range and cage-free labels. Educate your friends and family. We do have resources on our website. We have leaflets and also some videos that I think are really helpful explaining the issues. And joining our action team. Like I said, we've got folks who are just dedicated to helping people become activists, no matter what issues they want to work on, whether it's eggs and meat, vegan issues, animals used in entertainment, SeaWorld, whatever people want to work on, we're happy to get them working on it.
Amber Canavan of PETA campaigns on how you can move forward after Prop 12. If you're in California or if you're anywhere else in the country, election night is just one night. If you eat, you vote every time you eat. You might say you vote every time you're at a meal. Vote for the animals. Go vegan. Go to PETA.org or click on the links on the show notes. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on AMOK.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Or listen wherever you podcast. Just listen to the PETA Podcast. And don't forget, you can help the animals in PETA, especially if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Emil Guillermo.